Welcome to the Christian Mysticism Podcast, where we explore the fascinating history of Christian mysticism from the early days of the church until today. I'm Alberto de la Cruz, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Carlos Eire, the T. Lawrence Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. Welcome back, Carlos.
Hey, it's great to be here again.
Same here. Glad to be back on with you and looking forward to this episode. And before we get started, I want to remind all our listeners, if you haven't liked our podcast or subscribed, please do. Click that like button, click the subscribe button. It really helps to bring the podcast up, and hopefully more people will listen to it and our audience can grow. And we also want to thank you all for all the great emails that we continue to get and the great questions. We do appreciate your support, and we look forward to hearing from you every time. So as we left off from our last show, on this episode, we're going to get into the Bible and what the Bible's role is in mysticism. And we're splitting this up into two episodes. The first episode will talk about the Old Testament, and on the second episode, we'll go into the New Testament. But this being the first one, we're going with the Old Testament. What do you have for us, Carlos?
We have so many texts, it's actually hard to choose for a 1 hour show, which verses to take out of biblical texts, because this is such a crucial, absolutely essential point of inspiration for Christian mysticism. And what I know, because I teach this course on Christian mysticism, that the students that I have had over the years, some of them feel a little confused about the fact that Christian mystics are citing the Old Testament so much, especially the Psalms. Right? And it takes some explaining to get them to realize that, in fact, so many of the Christian mystics that we know of, there are so many we don't know about, but so many of the ones that we do know something about were monks and nuns. And monks and nuns recite the Psalms constantly. As a matter of fact, in monasteries of the Benedictine tradition, you're supposed to go through all 150 Psalms every week. So they're constantly exposed to these texts, which are prayers. So that's what they do, right? That's what mystics do. They deny themselves sensory gratification and they pray. But so much of their praying is rooted in the Bible. And interpreting these texts also becomes a fascination for many monastics, such as Bernard of Clairvaux, for instance, wrote many commentaries. And there is no text that received more comments than the Song of Songs. It's very highly erotic dialogue between the bride and bridegroom, which in Christian monastic exegesis or interpretation of the Bible was taken to be a conversation between God and the soul. So today we're not going to be focusing all that much on the Song of Songs because the texts themselves are not as explicit about the relationship between the divine and the human as the Psalms. They are, in the Christian tradition, those texts from the Song of Songs, highly allegorical. So I think that focusing on the Psalms gets us much closer to the roots of Christian mysticism, and keeping in mind that the Psalms were composed centuries before the birth of Christ. I think it's one of the more convincing lines that we can trace between the pre-Christian Jewish religion and Christianity itself. In fact, as we go on today, going through some of these texts, I hope our listeners will be able to better appreciate how Jewish Christian mysticism is, especially in regards to its interpretation of the relationship between the human and the divine.
Well, in preparation for the show, you put together a list of some verses from the Old Testament, and we're going to do a little bit of a different format than we normally do, and we're going to go through these texts, and you can give us some insight on how they pertain to Christian mysticism. So I'll get started, and I'm going to read the first verse we have on our list, and it comes from Psalm 16:11. Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore.
Boy, there's so much packed in there. First line, I'll say you rather than thou. You will show me the path of life. Speaking of a path, and mysticism is a journey, always interpreted as a journey by those who embark on it. And it is a path that you have to choose. But you can very easily get lost in that path. So what this first line says to me, and I have seen Christian exegesis do, is this Christians turn this passage, just this one line, into the need for God's grace and God's guidance in the path. But what path is it? It's the path of life, because this is all about this life. And then as Christians interpret it, it's not just about this life, but eternal life. And it's a journey that God directs. And then the second line, in your presence is fullness of joy. Oh, this is so important. This is what Christians turn into the very essence of heaven and eternal life, is eternal joy. In your presence is fullness of joy. And as we will see as we go through some of these texts from the Psalms, this concept of presence, right, of the presence of God is so pervasive throughout the Psalms. And also, I should add, the Song of Songs. It's a reference to the issue that God is not always felt to be present. Because there's a difference between the real presence of God, which is constant throughout creation, to the way in which humans discern or feel that presence. So whenever God shows up, right, or whenever a human gets to feel the presence of God, that is joy. And as Christians would interpret it, the ultimate joy. It's eternal joy, beatitude or beatitudo, as St. Thomas Aquinas said in Latin. And then this, at your right hand there are pleasures forevermore. So even here in this text, you get a sense that the presence of God, if it's permanent, is forever. And all this talk about the right hand of God in the Old Testament also applies later to Jesus Christ himself, who ascends to heaven and then sits where? Where does he sit? He sits at the right hand of God, which is an allusion to the way in which courts in the ancient world were stratified. They had hierarchies and so on. So at the right hand of the monarch was his most powerful hand and the best location for anyone to be placed next to the monarch. So these few lines here are not only of significance to the development of Christian mysticism, but also Christian conceptions of heaven and eternal life. And one can see how deeply embedded not only Christian mysticism, but Christian eschatology, the conceptions of the afterlife, are just in these few lines from one of the 150 Psalms. That's what I find so amazing about this text we just read.
What struck me about this text, and you mentioned it about the journey, and most of the mystics that if not all, that we've discussed on the podcast have gone on a journey towards their mysticism, working their way towards it. So, and it does fill them with joy, and you get to that part of at the right hand there are pleasures forevermore. It's that eternal connection that they got to experience in this life that we all hope to experience in the afterlife. So I can see the connections here between this short single verse in the Psalms and mysticism.
I mean, it's there, it jumps out at you. But as we go through other passages, it's very interesting to note what different elements of the mystical tradition jump out at any Christian reader. Well, here's Psalm 19, verses 9 to 10. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. Again, lots packed in there. The first verse, verse 9. What is the fear of the Lord? That appears constantly in the Old Testament. The fear of the Lord is an English translation of a Hebrew term that means a lot more than just, what we fear. People fear things when they're potentially dangerous, right? There's some element of that in the term used here that's translated as fear, but it's also awe, being awed, completely overawed by the greatness of God. But at the very same time, you're awed, but notice what the next line says. The decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. And this is another element of awe that inspires fear, because the decrees of the Lord is the law given to humans by God through Moses. And what is stipulated here very, very clearly is that God's laws are righteous or just, and those who do not obey these laws, those who don't fear angering God, they are in for trouble. So again, paradox being central to Christian mysticism in the interpretation of this passage, you have to have respect for the law because it's the way to salvation. But at the very same time, you have to fear the consequences of what might happen if you don't obey the law. And then in the next verse, verse 10, notice, what about these decrees of the Lord that are firm and righteous? They are more precious than gold. And this is a metaphor that we can still understand in our world, where gold is still such a highly valued precious metal. Is there anything higher than gold? Maybe diamonds are worth more. I don't know. I don't keep up with these things. But much pure gold, more precious than gold, than much pure gold. This is, again, back to the path that we were talking about from Psalm 16. What is that path? That path is actually doing what is right, doing what is correct, doing what pleases God. And not only are they more precious than gold, here's where we come to a metaphor that Christian mystics tend to go wild with. The sweetness, the sweetness of God. What a mixture here of paradoxical propositions that, you need to fear the Lord, you need to respect the Lord, you have to be in awe of the Lord, and actually also, be very careful what steps you take and what path you follow. But if you do it the right way, sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. And we have to keep in mind that there was no sugar cane in the place and time where this was written. Honey was the equivalent of our sugar, the real sweetness. So Christian interpreters have also focused on the fact that, honey comes from bees. And how do bees make honey? Well, they make this wonderful substance by all following the rules. The beehive is very, very carefully and clearly organized, and it's got a hierarchy, and everyone does their share to produce this precious thing. So you can imagine monastics interpreting this passage. I'm always reminded of this huge stained glass window at St. John's Abbey in Minnesota, where I taught for 2 years. The architect, Marcel Breuer, this huge window that covers the entire front of the monastery's chapel, which is immense. When you say chapel, people sometimes think, it's a tiny little church. No, this is an immense building. And the stained glass window, which is about 4 or 5 stories tall, is a honeycomb. The monastery is honeycomb. What are monasteries all about? Rules, following rules. So layer upon layer upon layer of interpretation given here to the way in which you get to this precious gold. You get to this precious sweet stuff, honey, is following the correct path. So maybe at this point, we should remind our listeners that what we're doing here today is we're focusing on what the Christian interpretation of these texts was, more than on whatever the original intentions of the author might have been. Because for most of Christian history, there was no historical biblical scholarship such as what emerged in the 19th century. And you read, historical biblical scholarship from the 19th century through the 20th and into the 21st, and you read what was intended by this passage. What you might end up finding someone saying is not what we're focusing on here now, which is the role played by texts like this in the development of Christian mysticism.
That's a very good point. And obviously, Jewish interpretation of these Psalms will likely be a little bit different, because for Christians, the New Testament is a continuation of the Old Testament, and Christ is a continuation. But what we're trying to do in this episode is show how mystics went to the Old Testament, not just the New Testament, but the Old Testament, and found inspiration and found, for lack of a better term, instruction on how to get closer to God and how to connect with God on a mystical plane, as opposed to looking at it from a historical perspective or stories from the Old Testament. That was the Old Covenant, Christ is the New Covenant. For mystics, they looked at it all and as an inspiration, which brings us to the next verse we're going to look into, which is one of my favorite Psalms, and it's Psalm 27, verses 4 and verse 8, and I'll read it. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord, and to seek him in his temple. When thou said, seek ye my face, my heart said unto thee, thy face, Lord, I will seek.
Yes. Wow. Notice that metaphorical expression of God having a face, which makes God human, which is a reference to Genesis, the creation of humankind, of Adam and Eve, being made in God's image and likeness. So let's enter these verses from Psalm 27 from that perspective. When you said, seek ye my face, my heart said unto you, your face, Lord, I will seek. Wow. We can jump right to Meister Eckhart, 14th century. His idea of the spark of the divine in the soul, the likeness, the absolute likeness between human being and the divine. There you find it, and boy, does this passage get heavy in terms of its weight, the weight it carries. Seeking God's face is the mystical path. It is the purpose of life. Purpose of life, as interpreted by Christian mystics, is seeking this intimacy with God. And back also again to that idea of presence, right? What makes someone present to you more than anything else? Their face, seeing their face. This is why letter writing, speaking on the phone, they're good, they're great. You actually do communicate with people, but you're not seeing their face, and it's not fully that person. And seeing somebody's face on a computer screen is not the same thing as seeing the face. So this is all about seeking God's presence, which means, of course, bottom line, God is not only real, but you're capable. As a human being, you're capable of feeling his presence, of seeing his face. But let's go back to the beginning there. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. Again, this is pointing towards not just all the days of this life, but forever in the Christian interpretation. Once again, this informs Christian eschatology. Eternity dwelling in the house of the Lord. Of course, the reference here, the real historical reference, is to the temple in Jerusalem, which the psalmist goes on to say, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. Because there was this belief at the time that this psalm was written, that God was fully present in the temple, especially in the Holy of Holies. So this is all about getting to the inner sanctum, as the Holy of Holies is called in Latin. The inner sanctum, the innermost part of the temple where God dwells most fully. And what do you do when you get there? You gaze. You gaze at what? The beauty of the Lord. Oh, you can imagine what Christian mystics do with this passage. And monastics who might not be considered mystics per se. This is their quest. And God is beautiful. The temple is beautiful. God is beautiful. So again, the end goal is truth, goodness, beauty. Greek philosophy, this terminology became Christianized in monasticism. God is truth, goodness, and beauty. This line has always reminded me of a line from a poem by John of the Cross, which we might have dwelt on before, but it's one of the most beautiful lines in all Spanish poetry. And I'll say it in Spanish first, and then we move on to the English. John of the Cross, this is basically a poem which is a commentary on the Song of Songs. And the soul is speaking to God. God is not present, because he's not always present. The bridegroom and the bride are not always in each other's presence. So St. John of the Cross writes this line: Descubre tu presencia, y máteme tu hermosura. Mira, que la dolencia de amor no se cura, sino con la presencia y la figura. Wow, that's the Psalms. That's the Song of Songs. That's John of the Cross. Descubre tu presencia means, let me see your presence. Present yourself. Descubrir is to find, right? To find. Let me find your presence. Descubre, but it's also like uncover your presence, because the presence is always there, but you don't always see it. So that's what John of the Cross's poem is doing, a riff on this very same psalm, as well as the Song of Songs. Descubre tu presencia y máteme tu hermosura. Slay me with your beauty. A little bit of exaggeration there. Slay me with your beauty. The beauty of the Lord, right? Máteme tu hermosura. Mira que la dolencia de amor, because the pain caused by love, la dolencia de amor no se cura, sino con la presencia y la figura. This pain caused by love is not cured unless you have presence, and figura means not just the presence, the face, the body, la figura, the body, the face. That could be a completely secular love poem, not necessarily about love between human soul and God, but love between two human beings who are separated and long to see each other, right? So we're back to that central theme of Christian mysticism, which is totally suffused with the concept of love and lots of love imagery. So there is so much packed in here. And gazing, what is gazing? If you think of a painting, many of these paintings that represent mystical ecstasies of saints are often depicted just being very still, gazing on whatever this vision is that they're having. This contemplation. Contemplation and gazing are pretty much the same thing. You gaze on something and you contemplate it, and you can look at it and be so satisfied just by simply looking at its beauty, which is something I think all human beings react the same way regardless of what culture you're talking about. If there's something beautiful, it just knocks you down. And you want to keep looking at it because it's so pretty, so beautiful, whatever it is. But especially a person you love. And especially when that love is reciprocated, the person you love who loves you back. Oh, wow. So, my heart said unto you, your face, Lord, I will seek. Heart, once again, love. So the layers of interpretation on this Psalm 27 are so many, and each one of them so thick that we could end up taking another 30 minutes just on this one. But just so that our listeners will realize this psalm actually refers to other texts in the Old Testament. Where does that seeking God's face come from? Because the psalmist here says, when you said, seek my face. Well, when did God say that? Well, 1 Chronicles 16:11. Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his face continually. Not just seek his face, but seek it continually. And you also find this, I don't know what the timing is of, when Proverbs were written and when the Psalm was written, but Proverbs 8:17 also has an echo of this, a line from 1 Chronicles. Proverbs 8:17 says, I love them that love me, and those that seek me early shall find me. And then there's Isaiah 55, verse 6, another echo of this text from Chronicles. Seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Once again, that theme of, presence, nearness, and the fact that you can seek the Lord and find him. But you have to make some effort, right? This is all about effort. So there's a beautiful way in which these different texts from the Old Testament link together and are reflected in the Psalms. And then Christians meditate on this and actually organize their lives in such a way that their entire life is seeking God's face, seeking his presence.
Going back into the Psalms, we have Psalm 42, verses 1 through 3, which I'll share. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God?
Yes, this psalm, almost more than all others, has received intense attention from Christian mystics. And the theme here is interpreted by Christian mystics the way in which God is not always reachable, and that there are, in fact, painful, dark periods where all you have is absence rather than presence, right? What St. John of the Cross would later call the dark night of the soul. So, once again, this is all about emotion, longing, thirsting. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. And that's a very important passage right there. The living God. God is eternal. His existence, his life, his living is so much greater than yours. You're seeking him because he lives. And what are you seeking? Once again, the face of God. The lines I would like to focus on are the ones that say, my tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God? Is a reference to the fact that God is invisible. And the mystic who has experienced the divine and has had moments of intimacy with the divine, perhaps even, seen the face metaphorically, but not metaphorically in the case of Jesus. Someone like Teresa of Avila who had visions of Jesus. His face is beautiful. And that is God's face. Jesus' face is God's face. But there are those who mock the mystic, those who mock those who devote themselves to seeking the contemplation of God, because no one else can see God. And perhaps when this person is having a dry spell, one of these dark moments where God seems very distant rather than present, and they see that this person is not getting anywhere with their journey towards the divine, they can be very easily mocked. So people say, where is your God? And the interpretation often given to that line is that it's doubly hard to seek God, not just because the path is often difficult, though it also filled with joy, but people around you not only perhaps don't understand what you're doing, but might be mocking you. And in the 21st century, given our culture, our secular culture, and how many individuals who, they consider themselves intellectuals, and are intellectuals, and scientists are atheists. And this line refers pretty much to anyone who's a believer in the 21st century. People saying continually, where is your God? especially when bad things happen. So this idea of thirsting is also echoed in Psalm 63, verses 1 to 3. O God, you are my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see your power and your glory, so as I have seen you in the sanctuary, reference to the temple. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise you. There's a lot packed in there, but these two psalms are linked, and they're also linked to the previous ones that we read in so many different ways that I hope our listeners can begin to see the way in which that entering the Psalms is like being in a hall of mirrors with all of these references to each other and to other biblical texts. But all these mirrors, what they're showing you, the images that they are presenting you with, all have to do with longing, a journey, presence, absence, joy, sweetness, and so on. Imagine having to recite or sing these 150 prayers every week, how they can become embedded in your brain and actually shape not just your very thinking, but your entire life. So this is one of the many reasons that of all of the books of the Old Testament, the Psalms became the most mystical. And it's not just Christian monks and nuns who love the Psalms. John Calvin, Protestant, leader of the church in Geneva and then later in many other parts of Europe, the Reformed Protestant tradition. Oh boy, did he love the Psalms. And oh boy, did Calvinists sing and recite the Psalms over and over and over again. One of the most often printed books in the 16th century and into the 17th was the so-called Geneva Psalter, which were French translations of the Psalms, which were used in Reformed Protestant worship. So there's another branch of the tree, the mystical tree, but of course their interpretations were different.
It's interesting you mentioned that because it just reminded me when I was a kid, I was given a little New Testament, a Bible. Someone handed it to me, gave it to me from I don't know if it was a Baptist church or whatever, but I remember it was a little small Bible and you can stick it in your pocket, and the text was very small on it, but I was young and my eyes were still good, so I could read it. But what I always found interesting about it was the New Testament, but it also included the Psalms. None of the Old Testament, but it had the Psalms and the New Testament.
Yes, I've received over my lifetime 3 or 4 of those. They're like miniature, New Testament and Psalms, New Testament and Psalms. Yes, and there's a reason for that, of course. It's a way of praying. And for many Protestants, the best prayers of all are the Psalms. They're biblical, for heaven's sakes, So they are the Word of God. And although in the Reformed Protestant tradition, there's no goal of mystical ecstasy as Catholics have. It's very different. It's a closeness to God that doesn't involve all these physical ecstasies and miracles that we have been talking about concerning other mystics. So it's a different read, but there's this keen focus on the Psalms as absolutely essential for any Christian who wants to have a relationship with the divine.
Therefore, it should come as no surprise to any of our listeners that our next Bible reading will come from the book of Psalms, and this one is Psalm 136. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords. His love endures forever. And that repeats 23 times.
Yes, 23. I guess people who are familiar with music lyrics are familiar with the concept of reciting a verse over and over again because that's the one that's full of the deepest meaning you want to get across. But this idea of God's love enduring forever is another of these very, very densely packed statements, because the focus here is dual. It's love that endures forever. It's assumed God, of course, is eternal. He endures forever. But what's essential in this passage, repeated over and over and over again, is that God's love is also eternal. And that's what people are seeking, or what people should seek. So the eternity of love, the strongest of human emotions, let me rephrase that. It is one of the strongest human emotions. It's not the only one that's really strong, because all the other emotions can be very strong too. But this one is the one that mystics, Christian mystics, prefer to focus on, because that other opposite emotion, anger, is not good in the Christian mystical tradition. Love is what you're aiming for.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, and you've mentioned it again not too long ago, about these nuns and monks that were required to read the Psalms every week, all 150 of them. And as you said, it has to have an effect on you because it just gets ingrained in you. And as we read these that we're featuring on this episode, and in my case, just coming across them reading the Bible, they are powerful. And for Catholics who go to Mass daily or go to Mass once a week, but there's a daily gospel, and every single one includes a canticle, which most of the time is a psalm. And it all connects with the first reading. If it's a Sunday Mass or a Holy Day of Obligation, there's a second reading, and then there's the gospel reading. But that canticle, that psalm, which is usually a psalm, always connects all of the readings together. And it plays such an important role in Christianity, even though it was the Old Testament, because it all connects. For Christians, all of this connects.
Absolutely. And, the monks and nuns who practice saying or chanting all 150 every week get a heavier exposure to it. But the Christian laity, Catholic laity, get exposed to it often enough. And in the Catholic Mass, in the Catholic Missal, that is the way in which the readings are organized throughout the year, often in the responsorial psalms, they'll take 3 or 4 psalms and mix them up together, right? Mix the lines that fit the other biblical readings the best. So if you look at the Missal, you often see 3 or 4 different psalms listed, and you're reading 1 line from each, maybe 2 lines, 3 lines. It doesn't matter, but it's the exposure. You're right. This exposure is very much a part of the shaping of Christian consciousness during that ritual of the Mass. Yeah, very much so.
Well, we have one last reading before we go. Why don't you read that one for us, Carlos?
Okay, Psalm 139, verses 7 through 10. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? There's that presence again. Where shall I flee? If I ascend up into heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. So, back to that theme of presence, that theme of guidance, that God is guiding you, God is taking you places. Even there, your hand will lead me. And what is that there? The uttermost parts of the sea. You can't get away from God is the other theme. Perhaps the central theme in these lines is God is not just everywhere, but always with you. And we go back to Meister Eckhart's idea of the divine spark in the human soul. You don't get to God by going outside yourself. No, you get to God primarily by going within yourself to find that divine connection. But you can't get away from God. And not only can you not get away from him, but if you're going in any direction towards the face, the presence, he's going to lead you. He's going to take you to wherever he is. So that's the way that these passages get interpreted. And, there's a big difference between singing one of these and reciting it. And it's something that I've always wondered about, because if anyone in our audience is aware of Gregorian chant and what it sounds like, Gregorian chant syllables get stretched. And going through an entire psalm or part of a psalm, not only does the text get stretched, but the meaning of each word gets stretched out with emphases being placed on different syllables, different parts of the word. So it's a lot like looking into a kaleidoscope. It's one way I like to think about it. And think of the book of Psalms as a kaleidoscope that has all of these, the number of little things that are inside the kaleidoscope is limited. Let's say that there are 32 little tiny bright bits of different colors. And every time you turn it, you see something different because of the lenses in the kaleidoscope. And come to think of it, that was one of my very first bits of contemplation as a child. First time I got my hands on a kaleidoscope, I was just completely blown away. And, I'd turn it a little bit and get this beautiful image. I'd stare at that for a while, then I'd turn it just a little bit more, and the whole image would change, and I'd stare at that for a while. So that's pretty much the way that these texts are in the Christian mystical tradition.
You're certainly right that these psalms being sung are completely different than reading them. Not that the words change so much, but that just the way they come across. And as a frustrated musician, I've often wondered, and I would have loved to have heard, assuming David wrote all these psalms, I would have loved to have heard him sing them, hear what it sounded like when he sang them. That must have been an incredible experience, because even though maybe he can be considered a mystic, but not traditionally considered a mystic, he had a connection to God, according to Scripture, that very few people on this earth have had. And I can't even begin to imagine what his psalm sung would sound like. And even though I probably wouldn't have understood a word of it, but just to hear the music, to hear the melody, to hear him sing it, I think would probably blow away anything we've ever seen or heard.
Yes, and I've seen some attempts at recreating this, and every time I've seen one of these, they're each so different from the other. I don't know if, what the music history is, how close anyone can come to reproducing what was sung centuries before Christ.
Unfortunately, I don't think sheet music had been invented yet.
No, I don't think so either.
So it isn't like they could find some old scrolls with some sheet music on it that were used. But maybe when we're all in heaven, we'll get to hear David sing it.
Standing room only, so I hear.
And it's a free concert, too.
Yes, free. Free, no Ticketmaster or anything to go through. Yes, absolutely. What a great pleasure that will be.
Well, on our next episode, we're going to go through some verses in the New Testament that have inspired mystics, and we look forward to see how mystics use the New Testament to find inspiration in their divine connections to God.
Yes, and it will be, as was the case today, just a small selection of all the texts that could be analyzed. Because, of course, in Christian theology, the Bible is the most often quoted text. It has to be. And that's, in theology, thinking about religion. But in Christian piety, yes, of course, the Bible also is the mother lode for ritual, for prayer, for symbols, for everything that makes up religion.
Well, I'm looking forward to our next episode. Thank you, Carlos, and thank you for all our listeners, and we'll see you next time on the Christian Mysticism Podcast. If you have any questions for Dr. Eire, you'll find our email address in the show notes. Just send it over and we'll try to answer it in a future episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast.